So the main goal is to get that subframe there, using that hardware, installed into the car, and get the control arms hooked up, and hopefully have some time to get the knuckles separated so we can put some RCAs in there. Using a floor jack and a block of wood, I can lift up the cross member very delicately towards the rest of the car. And with using one or two of the subframe bolts, you can guide it to get kind of fairly square. And you're just working on getting the subframe square so we can bolt it in. And there's a little trick. You can actually reach, if you get the fender off underneath here with the nut and the washer, and get to it rather than inside. It's also easy to do inside, but right now since my car's up in the air, it's a challenge to get into there. But right here, now the subframe is up tight, I can hold it with this here and then reach down underneath this way with the washer and the nut to get them started. And because these have these little flanges on here, you don't really need to use a wrench. You can just tighten them down from underneath. So that's what we're going to do right now. While we're here, I think we're going to try to crack these knuckles off so I can put the NC-RCAs in there. Turn it this way just to show you I can get that bolt loose. Now sometimes it'll get tight because your socket will hit the control arm. Usually you can kind of find a sweet spot. Or you might have to switch over to like a ratcheting wrench or just a box wrench and use the open end to get the last little bit out. It's a pain, but a lot of times you can get it with the socket if you just play with it and try to find the right angle. So there's that bolt. This is the front side bolt. We'll hit it pretty much the same way. This one's a little bit easier access. And you can tell I've had these apart recently because they're kind of coming apart. Naturally, these don't always do this. A lot of times they take a little coercing to get them to separate, but These actually haven't been driven on since they've been put together, so they're coming apart nice and easy for us. All right, so we got our strut loose from our knuckle now, and now I should explain why. Right, and the reason we separated this is because we're going to be going ahead and inserting a roll center adjuster known as an RCA. This is actually a negative camber roll center adjuster. So normally this would be just a straight hole all the way through, and it would simply just be a spacer. What that does is that pushes this part of the control arm back down for in cases when you've lowered your vehicle, this control arm gets too level to the ground. It's supposed to be at a downward angle, and adding this spacer will push that control arm back down, reducing bump steer. In addition, this is a negative camber roll center adjuster. It actually offsets the strut, and it pushes the strut further away from the knuckle. Now, that increases scrub radius, which we'll talk about, but it also increases negative camber. So it's another way of gaining a little bit more camber and a little bit more track, because it'll push the strut out further away from the chassis or the center of the chassis, and therefore pushing out the hub and the wheel. So you'll notice as we lift this off the knuckle here, alright, there we go, that there's these little dowels kind of that go up inside the strut. So that's the same way we're going to line this up. We're going to use those dowels to go up inside the strut. And notice that these have space for those dowels. They also have this big pocket here for this castle nut. Normally the strut, it has a big pocket in here too. So that's the way we're going to bolt that on. This will go on here, and the strut is going to go out here, and boom, voila. We've got more camber, more track, and less bumps here. So we gotta get it bolted to the strut first. So we're trying to pop it in like that and get a bolt started. Get the other one started. NC-RCA is mounted to your strut. Time to push it up over the crown and onto the knuckle. And you can already kind of see how it's spaced out now, and it's pushed it out further. And this sometimes is the art of getting just the perfect angles and just kind of walking it. There we go. Until it pops into place. Carefully your fingers. There we we are. Popped into place, it's seated nice. There we go. Fully seated now. Get the other bolts in. Now these replace the old hardware. These are 19 millimeter instead of, I believe, the 17 or the 14s that came out. I do know these are bigger though. As you can see, T3 here, they are made by Techno Tuning. I don't have a ton of nice things to say about Techno Tuning as far as their customer service aspect of their business, but as far as their products actually are pretty top notch and are pretty good quality. So they are great. There's plenty of other retailers too that you can get them, so you don't have to go directly through T3. And other people have had better success than I have. I've had some bad experiences, but I've never had a bad experience with their product. It's always been just customer service. So take that as it will. Getting started on the other side. Sneak this big old socket in there. Now remember, this is an aluminum part that you're torquing into, so you are going to have, to be a little bit more careful with your torque specs because you don't want to strip out your aluminum part. And once you've turned it, come to this side, your other side. Alright, now if we bring this back to center, you can see how the strut now is spaced out this little bit, which means that this hub here is spaced out this much more and gives us that much wider. So it pushes the hub this direction and gives us just that much wider track when you add both sides done. So, cool. So let's just pretend this is our wheel, okay? Now if we were to mount it here up against the pivot point, it would simply just pivot in place. But because the strut is pushed away, the mounting surface pushes away from our pivot point, it actually scrubs. It moves forward and back as we steer. And that is known as scrub radius. So one drawback of the NC-RCA is it pushes the spindle out away from the pivot point, the ball joint, increasing your scrub radius. So again, if it was mounted completely to the pivot point, which is not possible with this style strut, but just for an example, it would just simply pivot. When it's mounted in the factory location, it scrubs. And then when we put it on the NC-RCA, it scrubs worse. So we are making a trade-off. We are trading extra scrub and a little bit weaker steering performance for the extra camber and track. Once we get the chance, we're going to go with longer control arms and then go with traditional roll center adjusters, which will bring the scrub radius back to factory. But for now, this is what we got, this is what we're working with, and it's a doable setup. It does work on track. It's not the best, but it's doable. So that's what we're going with, and hopefully that explains it. All right, guys, that's it for this one. I'm gonna go have a beer. Oh, and fuck you, Troy.